Okay, I think we're ready to begin now. Good morning and welcome to the third webinar in Colorado Center on Law and Policy's Communities Against Poverty event. This is Bob Mook. I'm CCLP's Communications Director, and I'm moderating today's presentation from my home office today. Before we begin this session, I want to thank and acknowledge the presenting sponsor of today's session, Colorado's Coalition for the Homeless. And I also want to thank and recognize the supporting sponsors of this webinar, Colorado Children's Campaign and CCLP's Executive Director, Tiffany Lynn. This morning's mini webinar is titled Protecting Tenants' Rights During the Pandemic. Over the next 20 minutes, we'll learn about the scope of the housing crisis amid COVID-19, what can be done to prevent Coloradans from being evicted, and due process protections. Then our panelist, Jack Regenbogen, will share some closing thoughts and take questions. Questions can be submitted throughout the presentation through the chat feature or through the Q&A feature. We will not answer them during the presentation, but we will reserve about 10 minutes at the end of the session where I'll curate the questions, read them aloud to Jack, and he'll answer them to the extent that he can. So with that said, I will introduce Jack Regenbogen. He's CCLP's senior attorney and the host of this morning's webinar. Jack joined CCLP in 2015. Since 2016, he has worked on several pieces of state legislation and local housing policy efforts. He was also the author of a groundbreaking 2017 report called Facing Eviction Alone. You can find that on our website. There's so much more to say about Jack and his accomplishments at CCLP, but in the interest of keeping this webinar short, I will turn the virtual podium over to him. Good morning, Jack.
Thank you, Bob, and good morning, everyone. As Bob mentioned, I've been focused on affordable housing and eviction issues for the bulk of my time at CCLP. And I've become convinced that many evictions could be prevented to the satisfaction of both parties if the right public policies are in place. Housing insecurity was already a major challenge in Colorado, even before the pandemic. The onset of COVID and the corresponding job loss has greatly exacerbated these housing challenges. It's more important now than ever that community members and policymakers work together on finding solutions that will keep Coloradans housed. Next slide, please. So what is the scope of the housing crisis that we face today? And what's the policy landscape currently? According to COVID Eviction Defense Project estimates, nearly 450,000 Coloradans are at risk of an eviction by the end of 2020. In Colorado right now, more than 40% of adults are behind on their rent or mortgage payments, with eviction or foreclosure in the next 2 months, either very likely or somewhat likely, according to the Census Bureau's latest household pulse survey. This may be largely attributable to Colorado ranking 7th in the country for business closures since the onset of COVID. And while many tenants are falling behind on rent, there are also many renters who are only able to keep up by relying on unstable funding sources, such as taking out larger credit card debt. Now, there are currently a few policies in place that offer short-term relief to renters. Federally, the CDC has an order that prevents evictions due to non-payment of rent if a tenant submits a sworn declaration that they meet certain conditions. In particular, they must attest that they expect to earn less than $99,000, or for joint filers, $198,000, that they've made every attempt to provide partial payment of rent, that they've exhausted reasonable attempts at obtaining public assistance, in that they would be likely to experience homelessness or a crowded living condition if they were evicted. Now, the governor of Colorado, Governor Jared Polis, has expanded on this federal policy through Executive Orders 223, 227, and as of yesterday, 255. These orders codified the federal policy in state law, and it also expanded it to include other types of evictions besides just those that are based on non-payment. So with the governor's order, it also applies to evictions that might be based on a lease expiring or a minor lease violation. These orders also required 30-day notice before an eviction can be filed. Typically, this would be 10 days. And the orders prohibited rental late fees from being charged. These emergency orders have to be renewed every 30 days, but the governor has indicated that he intends to renew them for at least the duration of 2020, possibly longer. Furthermore, the state has provided more than $20 million for emergency rental assistance, and additional funding has been requested by the governor as part of a special session of the legislature, which is going to occur over the next couple of weeks. These are important policies because they provide temporary relief that will help prevent displacement and thus also help prevent the transmission of COVID. However, these policies are not a long-term solution to the housing crisis that we face as a state. Neither the federal nor the state orders prevent rent from accruing, which means that tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Coloradans are amassing debt that they will ultimately be responsible for repaying. And unless these current policies are extended, as of January 1st, 2021, all of these people will face the immediate threat of possible eviction. Next slide, please. What can we do to prevent Colorado from falling off an eviction cliff at the end of 2020? One obvious but crucial step is to extend the current moratorium for as long as needed, which would take into account the status of the pandemic and the reopening or reclosing of the economy. And although I would love to be wrong, it seems fairly likely that COVID transmission and high unemployment rates will still be an issue on January 1st, and that an extension of the moratorium order would be essential. For planning purposes, it would be very helpful for these orders to be extended sooner than later so that people would know the duration that they'll be protected. Beyond extending the short-term relief, there are other policy interventions that can provide long-term stability to renters who are facing hard times during this recession. Recently, I had the opportunity to present on a number of these policy recommendations to the governor's special eviction prevention task force. And in the remainder of this webinar, I wanted to highlight just a few of some of the most crucial of these recommendations. Perhaps the single most important step that Colorado can take to prevent evictions is to enact a requirement that a landlord offer a reasonable repayment agreement before they're able to pursue an eviction or collection action. Several states have adopted this policy, including Washington, Oregon, California, Michigan, and Washington, D.C. This is vitally important for preventing the flood of evictions that would likely occur otherwise at the beginning of 2021 when the eviction orders expire. Now, to be clear, this policy does not prevent landlords from filing an eviction, nor does it prevent them from collecting any rent that is owed within a reasonable time period. Instead, it simply requires that they work in good faith with tenants by offering a reasonable repayment plan before pursuing an eviction or collection. Tenants would still be obligated to pay rent, but they would have an opportunity to catch up in a time frame that's sustainable for both parties. The governor has encouraged repayment agreements in prior orders, and some landlords have done this, but not every landlord will. Some won't entertain repayment agreements either because they don't like the tenants, or in some instances, because the lease agreement allows them to collect more money if an eviction is carried out. Every tenant deserves a reasonable opportunity to recover from the crisis, and that will only happen if repayment opportunities are guaranteed and not simply just encouraged. Relatedly, until funding is depleted, landlords should be required to apply for the state's housing assistance program before they can evict for non-payment. Even with the governor's order, there are still some tenants who do not meet the full list of eligibility criteria and who remain vulnerable to an eviction based on non-payment. Now, we realize that this would be a temporary policy because these funds are finite, but while the funding exists, we should use every tool at our disposal for ensuring that the funding is fully utilized to prevent evictions. Next, the state also has a responsibility to address another impediment to housing, which are the rental late fees that tenants can be charged when rent is tendered late. Late fees are a major barrier to housing stability, and this was true even before the pandemic, but it's become even more urgent post-COVID. These fees are meant to reimburse landlords for their actual out-of-pocket cost incurred in tracking down late payments. They are not meant to be a penalty or a source of revenue. Now, some landlords do limit their late fees to a reasonable amount, but we often hear of cases where an exorbitant amount has been charged immediately after a payment is considered late. There is currently no state statute that limits how much a landlord can charge as a late fee or how quickly they can charge one after a rent payment is considered late. And while most homeowners receive a 15-day grace period before they'd be charged a late fee on their mortgage, many tenants don't receive any type of grace period. Complicating this issue even further, much of the state funding that is available for rental assistance is not allowed to be used for late fees. This means that even those tenants who qualify for assistance often have to pay late fee debt out of pocket. As such, we often hear of late fee debt as a contributing factor in evictions, and some evictions occur solely on the basis of unpaid late fees, even when back rent has been fully accounted for. Therefore, we hope to see an extension of the governor's temporary late fee moratorium, but we also urge state legislators to pass reasonable, permanent regulations on late fees. At minimum, the state should adopt a reasonable cap on late fees, a grace period before a fee can be charged, and a prohibition on evictions that are solely based on unpaid late fees. And this recommendation was also passed by the governor's Eviction Prevention Task Force. Next slide, please. Procedurally, there are some basic due process protections that are absent in eviction proceedings. There is no right to a jury trial, no guaranteed right to basic discovery of evidence to be able to get the documents related to your tenancy. This often depends on an individual judge and their discretion. And there's other procedural barriers. One major one in Colorado is that tenants who are experiencing habitability issues, unsafe living conditions, they cannot assert their rights in a non-payment eviction case unless they post bond and pay the court. Well, this prices renters out of bringing legitimate defenses in an eviction. The eviction court process should be reformed to allow for these basic legal rights and defenses. Relatedly, renters should also be able to pay back rent at any point before the eviction process concludes. Now, under current law, a tenant loses this legal right to cure or pay back an unpaid rent debt after the period of time for the rent demand, after it expires. In other words, this means that once an eviction is filed, even if the tenant can come up with the full amount of any debt that is owed, the landlord can decline to accept. Now, some landlords will accept payment, but others won't for various reasons. Giving tenants the right to pay at any point during the eviction process would improve the effectiveness of our emergency rental assistance systems, which can often take a few weeks to turn around. Another issue that warrants state intervention involves the penalties and enforcement against illegal lockouts, illegal evictions. Under Colorado law, it is generally illegal for a landlord to evict a tenant without a court order. i.e. by changing the locks or by shutting off utilities. In practice, however, this still happens, in large part because there are not sufficient remedies available to tenants when this occurs. In fact, the only recourse that's currently available is to try to find an attorney and sue in a private action. And then, if they're successful, the tenant is only allowed to recuperate actual economic damages. It can be tough to quantify and monetize the losses that a tenant experiences as a result of having been deprived access to their property. I've heard of one heartbreaking case recently where a landlord illegally evicted the tenant and in the process threw away all of her belongings, including the remains of her son who had passed away. How does one quantify that type of loss? Is it even possible? In light of these issues, the state should allow for a minimum amount of damages that the tenant is entitled to receive, which would be a meaningful deterrent for illegal evictions. The Attorney General's office should also be given standing or authority to enforce the prohibition on illegal lockouts, since many tenants are unable to find private counsel to bring on those types of cases. Our last recommendation is for the state to allocate additional funds for eviction legal defense. We found in our research that while landlords are represented around 90% of the time in eviction cases, tenants are represented by counsel in fewer than 1% of cases. However, the very few tenants who are represented and who are able to access legal assistance are much more likely to remain housed or have additional time to move or avoid an adverse eviction judgment from going on their record. Now, the state of Colorado does have an eviction legal defense program, but the future solvency of this program likely depends on developing new and permanent funding sources to sustain the program. Next slide. In closing, we need to be honest and realistic about the difficult situation that many Coloradans face. There are incredibly challenging times ahead for renters and for our communities. Eviction rates in Colorado were already a major concern before this crisis, and now we're at risk of witnessing displacement on a catastrophic level. But our situation is not hopeless. The resources exist. And there are policy solutions that can help prevent the worst from happening, policy solutions that can keep people housed. By working together, we can and we will get through this crisis. With that, I'd like to thank everyone for joining this call today. And I also want to invite any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thanks, Jack. I see we have a number of questions here in the Q&A box and the chat box. So I will begin fielding them and you can answer them one by one. Participants out there, feel free to drop in your questions. We'll take as many as we can during this session. The first one comes from an anonymous attendee, and it says, what can we as a state and community do to help get reasonable repayment agreements, housing assistance, attempt requirements, etc., implemented?
That's a great question. I appreciate that being asked. Fortunately, these are policy solutions where we can see action taken on either the executive or legislative branches of government. And we have seen some willingness from the governor's office to try to mitigate the consequences that we discussed, to mitigate the threat of displacement. The governor at this point has not required reasonable repayment opportunities. Again, he's encouraged those, but he hasn't required it. In other states, we have seen that accomplished through an executive order. For example, in Washington state, that was ordered through their governor's office. But we do have an opportunity with the legislature set to reconvene soon, first for a special session that will be fairly narrow, but then for a regular session that's scheduled to begin in January. And so at this point, I would encourage people to be reaching out to their elected officials at every level of government, whether that be executive, legislative, or local, because we really need to be utilizing every available channel for effectuating some of these policy interventions.
Okay, we have another question, again from an anonymous attendee. What are the biggest barriers to reforming due process for renters?
I think part of the problem, that's a great question. I think part of the problem is, as I mentioned, there is a real scarcity of legal aid available for tenants. There are amazing organizations that are doing incredible work with relatively little resources. Colorado Legal Services, Colorado Poverty Law Project, 9 to 5 Colorado, among others. The COVID Eviction Defense Project is a recent organization, and they're helping a lot of people, but they're vastly outnumbered. And so when there are procedural barriers in the eviction court process, there's just not enough attorneys available at the moment to assert those claims. So what we need is both greater parity in the rates of representation in court, and we probably need legislative intervention at some point, because many of the eviction court processes are set in state statute. So for example, the requirement that a tenant have to pay the court before they can assert a habitability of defense, that's set in statute. And so that's going to require some legislative action in order to correct. I think it starts by equalizing the playing field in court. And until we can have some degree of parity in the rates of representation, it's not going to be a fair system for tenants.
Great. Again, participants, we have questions and answers through the question and answer box or the chat. Well, we will be fielding them over the next few minutes. Jack, I have a question here from Donald Burns, who we all know. He's the co-founder of the Burns Institute of Poverty Research at CCLP. I suspect he might have a vested interest in this, but he asked, what is your relationship to the National Eviction Lab at Princeton University?
Well, thank you, Don, for the question, and thank you for all that you've done on this issue in terms of promoting housing security in Colorado. The Eviction Lab, as some background context for everyone, was really spearheaded by a researcher named Matthew Desmond, who's well known for his Pulitzer Prize winning book, Evicted. Fantastic book, if you haven't had a chance to read it, and really eye-opening. Since that book was published, he's helped start this eviction lab at Princeton University, which is doing some groundbreaking research into eviction trends nationally and on a local level. And fortunately, we have been able to be in touch with the eviction lab directly and also through our partners, and that helps inform some of our research. I will say that Colorado can be a bit challenging from a research perspective because the state doesn't collect a lot of data around evictions. There is some basic data that's published annually in the state's judicial report, where we can get a sense of how many evictions are being filed in each county. But beyond that, there isn't much in the way of data that's publicly reported. And so one thing that I would hope to see, and that would be, I think, of interest to the Eviction Lab, is for the state to start aggregating and publicizing some of the trends that they're seeing. How often do evictions result in a judgment for possession or an actual eviction order? How often are the parties represented by counsel? How often are counterclaims being brought? What are the demographics, racially, ethnically, in terms of age and child status? Some of this information is sorely lacking in Colorado. And so fortunately, we do have relationship with national research experts, and we hope to work with them on being able to collect some of this data in the future.
Thanks, Jack. And thank you, Don, for your question and for all you do for CCLP and on issues of poverty, homelessness, affordable housing, all of it. Jack, we have another question here from our colleague, Shar Robert. If more legislators are landlords than are tenants and experiencing this issue personally from the point of view of a landlord, how do you convince them to shift more power to tenants versus landlords? That's an exceptional question. An exceptionally good question, I have to say, Shar.
Well, one thing we can do is we can elect more renters into office. um, but in addition to that, in the short term, really what it takes is just a lot of working together to get our stories out there. Um, the landlord associations in Colorado are fairly well financed, and they have professionalized contract lobbyists at the Capitol every day representing their interest. And historically, there hasn't been as organized of a tenants lobby. Now that's been changing recently, in large part due to the great work of our direct service providing organizations and our grassroots organizing places like 9 to 5 Colorado, the Coalition for the Homeless, Enterprise, and other groups that participate in the Renters Roundtable. But that's a fairly recent development. And it reflects in our laws as a state. Colorado consistently ranks worst in the country. Most recently, I've seen we've ranked 43rd in the country among states in terms of renter protections. And so what we need is a concerted effort that will allow direct service providers, community organizing groups, policy groups, and community organizers and community members with lived experience working together to get their stories out there. Yeah, I reach out to legislators and I share some of the data that I shared in this presentation. And it's numbers. They're compelling numbers, but they're just numbers. And what really moves them and what moves public policy are stories and experiences and people who are willing to write their elected officials or testify in hearings. And so to the extent that tenants are able to participate in the legislative process, that's what really changes minds and changes hearts.
Okay, we have time for a couple more questions. We have another one from Don Burns. Homeowners can get tax breaks through, through mortgage interest deductions. Should we be thinking about tax breaks for renters?
I appreciate the question. I think I would frame it a little differently. I do think there's a strong need for direct financial assistance and for subsidization. Tax breaks can be tricky. A number of tenants may not file taxes if they earn income below a certain amount. So how do you reach that population? To give you one example, there's a fantastic program in Colorado called the PTC rebate, or the long name is the Property Tax Rent Heat Credit Rebate. And essentially, it's a rebate that's available to older Coloradans and people with disabilities that's intended to offset one of those costs, property taxes, rent, or utilities. So it's a great program, but it's been very underutilized. People don't know about it. They don't apply for it. The application can be cumbersome. And so we see that among the eligible population who would be entitled to receive the PTC rebate, less than half of Coloradans actually claim it. And so we need to have policies and programs that actually get financial assistance in the hands of the people who need it most. One of the ideas that has been floated on a national level by Matthew Desmond is the idea of a universal voucher that every person would be entitled to receive, that they could use towards either rental or for purchase housing. And I think this requires a philosophical change in how we look at housing, not just as a private commodity, but as a human right that everyone should be entitled to have access to, and that we have a collective responsibility to ensure that everyone has access to.
Okay, we have a couple more questions. Maybe you can address them briefly. This is from Kathy Smith, and she asked, how do you distinguish between the practices of small landlords and large corporate landlords?
Well, how do you distinguish in practice can be quite challenging. Very few places in Colorado actually track among their landlords in that area the size. So there's a rental registry, for example, in some cities in the state, but that's pretty rare. And otherwise, it's tough to say how large a landlord is or how small a landlord is. There are some differences in terms of their practices. and I'm generalizing here, but smaller landlords might be more willing to work with their tenants in a case-by-case basis, whereas the larger, more professionalized property management companies tend to have stricter codified policies that don't allow for individualized discretion. I will say as a general trend that after the last recession, so the housing crisis of '08 and '09, we've seen an overall trend towards professionalization of the industry. And so there are still mom and pop landlords who might have 1 unit or 2 units. They do exist and they are an important part of this economy. But more and more frequently, what we've seen is that with the foreclosure crisis, there were what's called REITs, REIT, Real Estate Investment Trust, that swooped in and purchased a number of these properties and commercialized them. And so, and a lot of these REITs may or may not even be based in state, may or may not even be based in the country. And so I think in terms of renters protections, at the end of the day, it's important that we have across the board protections that would be appropriate in both the small mom and pop context as well as the professionalized context.
Okay, we have time. Well, we don't really have time for one more question. We're over time, but we will take one more question and start winding down. We really appreciate the engagement in this particular session. Lots of good questions. Thank you everyone for participating. This question, Jack, comes from Laura Ware. And she asked, is there a public repository where the public can share their stories and get a coordinated response? Also, so these are in a central location. I'm not sure exactly what that last sentence means, but maybe you can, maybe either Laura, you can clarify, or Jack, you know what she's referring to there about central location.
Unfortunately, there really isn't. You know, for certain types of housing, there is state oversight. And the example that comes to mind is for residents in mobile home parks. There has now been set up a mobile home park oversight program where people can file formal complaints with the state's Division of Housing. But generally speaking, there isn't a public central repository where people can share their stories. And so that's why it's really important that we engage with other types of stakeholders, including the media. There's been a lot of great print journalists and online journalists who have been covering these issues in Colorado, and they've been very eager to work with community members and sharing their stories. There are organizing groups, United for a New Economy, 9 to 5 Colorado, many others who actively try to amplify the voices of community members. And those are some groups that are worth reaching out to. And then, of course, there are elected officials. And when there are regulations that are being considered or legislation, there are opportunities for providing public input, whether that be through verbal testimony or written testimony. And so there are a few channels that can help elevate these stories, but there isn't necessarily one centralized location. Perhaps there should be. Great.
Okay, well, I think with that, we will begin winding down this webinar. Thank you so much, Jack. If anyone has any questions offline for Jack, we've listed his email and his cell phone number here. You can find more information about Jack and CCLP on our website at cclponline.org. And we are, as I mentioned earlier, in the second day of our Communities Against Poverty virtual event. We still have a slew of activities. At noon today, we will have a keynote address from Tony Messenger. He is the Pulitzer Prize winning columnist for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. His specialty is issues of criminal justice, racial equity, and poverty. So he's right in our wheelhouse. It should be a very riveting discussion. The name of the keynote is The Price of Poverty, a story of profit and abuse in the name of justice. He won the Pulitzer Prize for his work on debtors' prisons in Missouri, which turns out to be a national issue, including in Colorado. At 4 p.m. today, we'll add a little levity to the 3-day virtual event with our CCLP happy hour. Some of our more fun-loving members of the staff will take part. So be sure to dial in for that and bring the beverage of your choice. You know, it could be any beverage. It could be a shake for that matter. That would be my beverage of choice if I could have the choice. And tomorrow, we will preview the State of Working Colorado report with Charlie Brennan. He's got an excellent presentation there. I really encourage everyone to dial in at that in the late morning. And then we'll close everything out at 2 p.m. with a message from our executive director, Tiffany Lennon. Again, we really appreciate you joining us here. All of the content from the 3 days, other than the happy hour, will be available on our YouTube channel. We'll socialize it at some point, probably early next week. We'll establish a Communities Against Poverty landing page where you could, if you missed any part of the presentations or any of the presentations, you can refer back to them. They'll be all archived online. And wrapping this up, I'd like to give another shout out to the sponsors of this webinar: Colorado Coalition for the Homeless, Colorado Children's Campaign, and Tiffany Lennon. I'd also like to thank all of the presenting sponsors for the Communities Against Poverty event. Here's the presenting sponsors. Here's the supporting sponsors. And with that said, again, thank you for participating. We'll see some of you in about another, I guess another 2.5 hours for the keynote address. Until then, happy Friday, and we'll see you soon. Thanks.